Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Lynn Akins, and I'm a member of the collections staff and reading room team at the Library Company of Philadelphia. Thanks for joining in our Black History Month programming. For those who may not be familiar, the Library Company of Philadelphia, founded in 1731, is an independent research library concentrating on American society and culture from the 17th through 19th centuries. The Library Company houses an extensive collection of African American history and culture, including rare books and manuscripts, broadsides, ephemera, prints, photographs, works of art, and more. Ranging from 1535 to the early 20th century, this always growing collection with over 13,000 titles and 1,000 graphics attempts to document Black life, enslaved and free, in the Americas, Africa, and the Caribbean. The Library Company's mission is to foster scholarship and increase public understanding of American history, which is why we're free and open to the public 5 days a week. I hope you'll stop by and visit us. Furthermore, we host a wide range of free public programming, which is what brings us here tonight. Fireside Chats. Launched in 2020 amidst the pandemic shutdowns, the Fireside Chat series continues as a platform to celebrate our diverse community of fellows, scholars, librarians, readers, and lifelong learners who are connected by the rich collections at the Library Company. Tonight, I'm thrilled to introduce one of those researchers whose work has enriched my own, informed countless Black liberation thinkers, and affirmed the experiences of Black women. So, with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jessica Millward, an American historian who focuses on African American history, early America, African diaspora, slavery, and gender. Her work also focuses on the female slave experiences by emphasizing narratives of Black women during slavery. And of course, she was a Mellon Fellow at the Library Company in 2018 and 2019. Dr. Millward's first book, Finding Charity's Folk, Enslaved and Free Black Women in Maryland, was published by the University of Georgia Press in 2015. Dr. Millward is the inaugural Inclusive Excellence Chair in Black Thriving and an associate professor in the History and African American Studies in the School of Thought at the University of California, Irvine. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens or put them in the chat. We'll address those questions after the presentation. So with no further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Wen. It's really exciting to be back at the Library Company, even over Zoom. I was a fellow in 2018, 2019 in person, before the pandemic, and it really literally feels like a lifetime ago. I'd like to thank all the archivists and librarians at the Library Company who have helped me with this project and who've ran down information that I might have needed, and just in general, helped me feel welcome in Philadelphia. In November 1866, Antoinette Hargrave, an African-American woman from Liberty County, Georgia, asked General Tilson, a field agent of Chapman County, to intervene on behalf of her children and herself. According to Tilson, Antoinette's husband, Abner, has been in the habit of beating her in a brutal manner and for no offense, that he is a very violent and passionate man and frequently beats their children as well. As Hargrave and her children were attempting to run away from Abner, Tilson reports that they were overtaken by her husband and the children were taken from her by him, all save one boy about 12 years old who escaped and came to the city of Savannah. Presented in 1866, a month after the state of Georgia refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, making African American citizens, Hargrave nonetheless asked the government, in the form of the Freedmen's Bureau, for protection and adjudication. She testified that she could care for and support her children and that they wanted Ashley to live with her. In addition to asserting the rights to her own body and to her children, Hargrave noted that her husband, Abner, was in possession of household effects and livestock that Antoinette had received from her father. Hargrave chose to appeal to the agents of Liberty County as her repeated attempts in her own county were going unaddressed. So generally, when I talk about Antoinette Hargrave, is in the context of the legal system and the changing legal system in Reconstruction. One of the things that I am very, very much solid on is I am, of course, a research scholar, right? My first book was Finding Charity's Folks. It was really written based at the Maryland Historical Society and looks at Black women after the American Revolution. And so when I switched to this particular project, it's a jump in time period, and it's a jump from just looking at Maryland to looking at domestic violence across the United States and what Black women responded to or how they responded to it um, in the decades after slavery. So we know when we think about the archive is really the question that everyone considers right now. Is the archive real? Is it a brick and mortar building? Is it sources? Is it something you can create digitally? And we know for better or worse, the archive represents our taxonomy of how we understand and process information. And the same is true when you look at Black women in the archive for this particular time period. Saidiya Hartman, many of you have read Saidiya Hartman, talks about when we go into the archive, we need to think about the ways in which there are some answers we know, and there's some answers we need to think about responsibly. So she speaks about critical fabulation. And this is a double gesture that can be described as straining against the limits of the archive to write a cultural history of the captive and at the same time enacting the impossibility of representing the lives of captives precisely through the process of narration. So I have students on the webinar today. We're doing Black Digital Humanities, and we were just speaking about how do you represent what is known and how do you represent what is unknown? And in some ways, that's what brought me to this project, because I've wondered historically through my own work, given that Black women's bodies have always been a site of conquest or contest and spectacle, I asked, did the image of African American women being brutalized really ever matter in the course of United States history? To what extent did African American women advocate for themselves, especially after the end of slavery, when they had legal control of their own bodies? What were their interactions with legal authorities? And what were the risks they faced if they appealed to the legal structure? And I know for the period after the Civil War, African American women used the Freedmen's Bureau to adjudicate these instances of intimate partner violence, because after all, this was the first time in American history they had legal control of their own bodies. Now, traditionally, when we speak about the archive of Black life and we think about the violence that is talked about after the Civil War, it's usually disproportionately speaks about Black men being lynched. It leaves out completely the Black women were also lynched. So I agree with Saidiya Hartman that we need to be responsible in terms of how we look at the archive. I'm less certain of saying that the archive is invisible to Black women, because if you pay attention carefully, Black women are everywhere in the archive. We are in the margins. We are in the margins of chattel records. We're in the text of letters that planters might send to their wives. African American women are all over the archive. And in some ways, they embody this legibility. Instead of being invisible, I argue that Black women in the archive embody a certain kind of legibility. And I hope to deepen our understanding of African American women in the wake of enslavement. Embodied legibility suggests that African American women were brought forth legal cases and filed petitions and made themselves civically, if we think about socially dead, by participating as someone in the legal process, they become, of course, civically alive. Okay. And also, I would like people to think about, when we think about Black women using the legal system after the Civil War, think about it in a way that perhaps it embraces the notion that transnational feminists and Black feminists talk about, and that's the notion of radical self-care. So though they're approaching a system that actually had once enslaved them, they also are very invested in a form of radical self-care that puts them beyond the reach of their partners. So the archive, as I say, that African American women and their experiences with abuse scream at us from the archive, from before the Civil War, obviously, when people were branded, they were whipped, to scientific experiments. The woman Darla in this picture that's looking at us with hollow eyes was part of an anthropological experiment. So when we talk about the archive and the politics of care, I am deliberately using this Black feminist lens to also care for the subjects that I'm writing about and to decide what their life must have looked like, right? There's a care that goes into representing enslaved people and formerly enslaved people in the way that they would want to be represented. So this brings us to stereotypes. I'm just going to jump ahead to stereotypes and so that we can open up the conversation in a deeper manner. When we think about the late 19th century, we think about stereotypes of African American women in particular, and the reemergence of the sapphire stereotype. The sapphire stereotype was, of course, quick-witted, could arguably be emasculating, and often was used in what this is a trade card as a way to justify the fact that African Americans weren't fit for freedom. So this is running alongside of African American women who are actually trying to negotiate their lives in freedom and to keep themselves and their children safe, right? Black women were subject to violence, not just by the men they might be sharing their home with, but they were still subject to violence, intimate violence by white men. And in many cases, we know from the research of the Folia Glimp, during the Emancipation period, Black women were still subject to violence at the hands of white women. So the end of slavery restructures the entire legal structure of the South, and there are new laws that are pushed against a long-established social norms. And these new laws clarified and complicated the legal composition of African American families. Laura Edwards and most recently Tara Hunter have examined marriage among African Americans in the Emancipation period. And in 1866, the same year that Antoinette Hargrave brings her suit to the authorities, the governor of Florida writes a letter that says, free people who are living as man and wife before emancipation and are mutually desire to continue in that relation shall legalize their marriage. But the governor, in this case, does not prescribe how cases are to be disposed of, wherein the parties are opposed to being regularly joined in the bonds of matrimony. And must confess, the governor goes on to say, that I'm at a loss to decide which of the two is to have the children. At this point, he's adjudicating a case between a couple that were married during slavery and wanted to go their separate ways. And he says, in terms of the court, if you want to stay married, that is fine. But if you do not want to be married, I'm at a loss of how to reconcile this. What this then does in this ruling in Florida and in other places, it means that African American men and women who may have been put together for the purposes of breeding and making a strong and stockly population for the owners, they might not want to be together in freedom. And they might have mixed feelings about it. And of course, it might end in a physical altercation. If we look at Virginia, at the case of John Berry versus Benjamin Triplett, Berry tried to remove his wife and 6 children from the home of Benjamin Triplett, who was actually the former slave owner. And while it was granted new security, while emancipation grants new security to Black domestic life, and legal marriage gave the chance to change circumstances of conflicts between husband and wife. It didn't always change circumstances where Black men were seeking to protect their wives and protect their children from violence from white people. So I talk about in this piece the politics of care. But before I get to that, I want to share just a few things that I found in the Library Company's archive. So while I'm focused on Black women and intimate violence with their partners, I found that in the collections at the Library Company, there were various ways that violence showed itself. And most of it happened in the documents I looked at in the form of trading cards. These trading cards were published. Sometimes they were put in the bottom of shopping bags. They were circulated throughout the communities. In this particular set, there's actually 5 images. Sister Snowball and a congregant in church get in a fight because Sister Snowball calls someone a liar. And so these panels then show the ways in which this scuffle that started with a dignified church meeting actually ends up in the streets with these women rolling on top of each other and fighting. And in some ways, this again, like the sapphire stereotype, the sapphire trading card, it's in the public domain, and it's still pressing against this notion of should Black people have freedom? This is another set of trading cards that I found at the library company that actually figure very prominently in this book. This is called a Declaration of Independence, and it was circa 1880. The front side, if we believe it's the front side, has a man and a woman who are arguably African American. You can tell by the hair, arguably African American woman, African Americans. And the husband doesn't seem too pleased with whatever declaration the woman is trying to gain for herself. And so then we have the result. What we have then is the man looking like he's beat the woman, her hair is falling out, they're disheveled. I propose that actually maybe in some ways this is also giving us a way into Black middle class life, and that there might be domestic disputes, right? Typically in the late 19th century with the maternal welfare movement and with the development of Black class culture, there's a middle class that shrouds parts of their inner lives from the larger public. Antoinette Hargrave, of course, goes to the court. She's a woman who's seeking some kind of freedom and protection from the Freedmen's Bureau. By the time we get to 1880, women, particularly middle-class women, may have actually withdrawn inside the household and kept these types of manners private, if Black women ever really had a private life. So I would also like to contend that we can read these trading cards a little differently, and that the result in the actual fight between the husband and wife took place first, and then we have them dressed up and ready to, conquer the world together after they comported themselves more. So those are 2 great things I found at the library company. The majority of research to put this kind of big narrative together comes from the Freedoms Bureau. It comes from the Freedman, the actual name is the U.S. Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, Abandoned Lands, and properly known as the Freedmen's Bureau. And this was established by Congress in 1865 to help former Black slaves and poor whites in the South in the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War. So there are a lot, millions really, of scraps of paper, letters, pension claims, a whole millions of documents that fit under what the National Archives considers the papers of the Freedmen's Bureau. 50,000 of those documents are housed at the University of Maryland, where I also spent my time during my fellowship year. And they only have about 2% of the entire collection that's housed at the National Archives, just to give you a scope of what kind of stories are out there about Black women trying to assert power over their lives, trying to enact some kind of politics of care. We only know a fraction of what their life was like because the documents themselves are so large and unwieldy. They have become digitized, which makes it easier for some scholars. But in my case, I took advantage of being in Philadelphia and went to College Park several times to also mine their archive. Let me go back. If the pandemic did anything for us over Zoom, it made us become very comfortable when technology didn't work and you're just on a live screen. So getting back to African Americans and the politics of care, and particularly Black women. Sharon Romeo demonstrates that during the war years, Black women took private and personal matters to military and to federal officials. So emancipation wasn't the first time in which Black women were trying to form some kind of demand, some kind of protection as soon-to-be citizens of the United States. And in doing so, they enter the public record. They're not invisible. They're this embodied, legible person that is telling about their grievances. They're talking about the ways in which they are putting demands on the federal government to protect them, okay? And in some ways, it's odd in this moment, the ending of slavery means that the federal government often privileged Black women's legal personhood, um, not just for the first time, but over and above the fact that this was the same population that the federal government, of course, had seen fit to uphold slavery and keep enslaved. When we acknowledge that the revolutionary actions of enslaved women who resisted rape and physical abuse, we must provide attention to these victims who became um, victims of violence, obviously, in freedom. So the same abuse that people would see in the slave community, whether it was being abused by an owner or, as Jeff Ford has showed us, abused slaves, abusing slaves in the slave community, intimate violence, or more or less violence that is stemming from some intimate relationship. We know that people don't change just because laws change. We know that, there are behaviors then in human nature where some of this violence and this violence within relationships tumbles into freedom. What changes now is Black women have the right, at least initially, to protest against their situation. This wasn't without complications. Vincent Woodard suggests that the enslaved did not possess their own flesh, right? When in slavery, people did not possess their own flesh. But as Antoinette Hargrave showed, she possessed the right to her own body and to her own flesh. And more importantly, she possessed what she believed to be the right to seek legal redress for violence she suffered at the hands of her husband. Deidre Cooper Owens, who is no stranger to the library company, her fascinating work, Medical Bondage, suggests that hapticity, this ability to touch and to coordinate, functions as an appropriate lens to view how enslaved Black women understood their lives, right? And so it makes sense also to use this in freedom. Abner literally put his hands on his wife, and she in turn initiated a process with the Freedmen's Bureau, hoping to put her children and herself outside of the sovereignty of his reach. Indeed, she claimed the rights to three things that African Americans felt very important after the war. First, they claimed ownership of their own body. Second, they consolidated their family. And third, they accumulated property. And as Dilla Pennyroth study notes, freed people valued both family and physical property as a form of wealth. The experience of Antoinette Hargrave was not unlike that of many newly emancipated African-American women who used the Freedmen's Bureau to adjudicate intimate partner violence. However, like I've said before, this transition with the ending of slavery, they have the right to bring these cases. And in some ways, what is less important than the actual number of cases brought to the court, what is more important to understand how African American women use this presence of the federal government in their overall approach to understanding their own rights to their own body, right? Enacting a form of Black feminist pedagogy, this self-care that I'm talking about. Antoinette Hargrave and women like her understood how the vehicle of the state, in the forms of the Freedmen's Bureau, could serve as a proverbial safe harbor against intimate violence. This was not without its own contradictions. Despite her attempts to leave her husband, Antoinette Hargrave's case was mitigated through the efforts of field agents, right, who were reading their white gaze onto this situation. So upon receipt of receiving his colleague's letter questioning why he didn't act in defense of Hargrave, field agent E. Yulee noted that Antoinette's complaints were chronic. He writes, last June, she came to me with a complaint that her husband had beaten her. I summoned the parties, investigated the matter, and found him guilty. and instructed both as to their respective marital duties and was about to punish him when she came forward, begged off, and lovingly went home with him. Shortly afterwards, she came complaining again and said that she must separate from him. I was in much great pains to arrange an amicable and fast separation from Abner, and she again made friends with him. The cost of both proceedings amounted to $2 for the two and remained unpaid to this date. To this field agent, the case was not worth investigating on several fronts. The first is that when he did so in June, Antoinette chose to go home with her husband. That she continued to lodge complaints, he surmised was 6 to 8 times. And that's not really surprising when we flash forward to the modern era, which we never do, right? We never talk about what is going on in this time period. We know that the average victim of domestic violence, it takes 7 times to leave their abuser. And this is in a society, a contemporary society, where there's cars that you can drive, where there's bank accounts. So imagine if one tried to leave their partner during the Emancipation period. Perhaps it was her own form of self-protection to go back to Abner until she could make strides and come up with a better plan to leave him. So while the public and private lines for Antoinette and what she should do and not do were a little blurry, the male head of the family still reigned supreme in law. Abner's children, for example, were subject to beatings quite a bit. The beating of his children not being beyond the law, I could legally not prohibit him from interfering. I could not legally prohibit him from beating his children, as it would interfere with his paternal rights and duties. To Yulee, children did not have the rights to their bodies and continued to fall under the purview of the parental and patriarchal head of household. And research by Laura Edwards and others note that this patriarchal nature of Southern law, and then we also see it extend to the North and the West, this patriarchal nature of the law extended rights to African-American men, and as this points out, in a sense, to the fact that they still had rights over their children. And it comes, again, a little bit more blurry when it comes to their wives. That Abner was allowed to physically discipline his children or beat them outright calls into question some present-day cases of the carceral state that we can talk about in the question and answer period, and whose right it is to actually touch another person. By 1875, white American women found themselves in conflict from what Elizabeth Pleck called the family ideal, the belief that the husband and father possessed the ultimate right to govern behavior in their homes over everyone. Ashley Baggett suggests that the expectations about the family power dynamic, which segregated the public and private divide within the context of marriage, shifted in the late 19th century. And this made it difficult, as I said, talking about middle-class women, for family or for legal intervention into some households. So Agent Yulee clearly positioned himself in favor of Abner's patriarchal rights. In his investigation, he found that Abner was an energetic and industrious fellow. He surmised that Antoinette, as he said, seemed to be one of those type women who always wanted to have a quarrel in order to make friends with her husband and quarrel again. We would call it modern day victim blaming. Back then, he was just simply observing, as he was supposed to do as a field agent. And we can read that so many ways. The field agent did instruct Abner not to beat Antoinette and was satisfied he had not done so. And in fact, Yulee used Antoinette's own admission that Abner had not assaulted her since June as his reason to turn a deaf ear, as she admitted to me he had not struck her. And since he had not done so, why should I intervene? And perhaps the most quantifiable theory for Yulee's action was not a theory at all. The Hargraves, and Antoinette in particular, had failed to pay the $2 they owed for bringing the case to begin with. He refused to take any actions, right? He goes initially from saying, they both owe $2. And then by the end of a series of letters, he talks about he refuses to take any action unless Antoinette would give security for the costs. So Yulee effectively equated the resolution of the cycle of violence and present to what's going on in the home as a financial situation that Antoinette had to rectify. So understanding how Antoinette Hargrave experienced a degree of violence at the hand of Abner was such that it was strong enough that she asked the government to intervene. And it strikes this new identity, this new legal identity for African-American women that I am speaking of and trying to call embodied legibility. An embodied legibility that meant that they were pressed to be seen. They wanted to be seen in court. They wanted to become worthy of protection, right? And we know that citizenship was broadly defined and limited to suffrage, but in this case, African-American women wanted to make sure that the government made sure on its promises that it kept for everyone, regardless of race. To be successful, though, in these cases, one must wonder if there was a formula for being seen. Typically, when you look at legal documents, there's a formula. There was a formula in freedom documents. The owner had to attest that the enslaved person could be freed and would be able to support and take care of themselves in freedom. I wonder if in some of these cases, to get a proper adjudication, perhaps there was a format that women had to follow in order to be heard. And so in some ways that brings us into question documents somewhat, but regardless, the fact that they're stepping into the government and talking to the government, again, represents a form of radical self-care. So Antoinette Hargrave disappears from the historical record after filing her complaint, but her husband does not. In 1867, 1 year after she lodges her complaint, he registers to vote in Liberty County, Georgia. Ironically, a year after tormenting Antoinette, Abner tried to enact his new privilege to vote. In 1870, an Abner Hargrave appeared in the census. He lived with a woman, the name is illegible, but it was not Antoinette, and 4 children. And according to the 1880 census, Abner Hargrave, a farmer, still lived in Liberty County, Georgia, but he lived with his 2 wives, Matilda and Peggy. One could only think what Antoinette made of this situation. Emancipated women such as Antoinette Hargrave used the Freedmen's Bureau to expose the trauma they endured in their relationships. However, by articulating their experiences to freedom agents, as we've seen, it put them in a form of, they submitted themselves to public scrutiny. The example of Antoinette Hargrave and her family has even larger implications, as it presents a unique view of intimate partner violence in the afterlife of slavery. African Americans in Georgia, like Antoinette Hargrave and her family, lived in one of the most violent states for formerly enslaved people in the 19th century. So, as we've seen, the politics of care was not limited to simple acts of resisting or responding to intimate partner violence. It meant mobilizing in a particular way. And I think in the entrance of time, since we lost some time due to my negligence, what I want to speak to a little bit is just some concluding thoughts. So African-American women lived in a world, in a sphere where popular culture portrayed them often in stereotypical ways, as we saw in the character of the Sapphire. Nonetheless, they used what was available to them in the legal structure to gain control of their bodies. What is clear is somewhere between the shackles of enslavement and freedom, African-American women utilized the court system to verbalize assault and violence in ways that made their experiences visible to more than just those in their intimate circles. At the same time, American popular culture depicted Black women as shrill and emasculating. Black women are calling for a change. There was a call from Black women to be seen in the archive and in the world in all their complexities and all their scales of legibility. Nonetheless, there are some areas and topics, even today, that some scholars and news outlets and policymakers are more comfortable leaving untouched. And just in conclusion, I always like to end with two thoughts. The first is the Combahee River Collective, the group of Black women in 1974 who, above all else, our politics sprang from the shared belief that Black women are inherently valuable and our liberation is a necessity, not as an adjunct to somebody else's, maybe because of our need as human persons for autonomy. This may seem so obvious as to sound simplistic, but it is apparent that no other ostensibly progressive movement has ever considered our specific oppression as a priority or worked seriously for the ending of that oppression. And because there are ways in which this project often bridges to survivors of the present day, I will leave Kathy Caruth's quote with us, which is, history, like trauma, is never simply one's own. History is precisely the way we are implicated in each other's trauma. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was wonderful to hear. And I'm gonna abuse my privilege of being a moderator of this to ask
Okay.
a question first, um, which is so I was thinking of this quote from this interview between Sadia Hartman and Frank Wilderson the whole time,
Mm-hmm.
the position of the unthought, and they say, you know, consent is meaningless if refusal is not an option, and I think that
Mm-hmm.
resonated a lot with so much of what you were sharing, and uh, I think a lot about information studies, information ethics. You know, what sort of narratives are happening when we treat information as a resource or as a product. Um, and you know, looking at Black lives and the archives, and having kind of this dominant narrative or maybe a dominant reality, you know, that we can't consent to the terms of our evaluation. I think your theory of embodied legibility offers a really interesting intervention into that for how we can kind of read refusal when it appears. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
just thinking about your project's connection to or yeah, I want to know more about the larger project, but also its connection maybe to like Black information ethics.
Ooh, so this project has grown and it's shrunk and it's grown and it's shrunk. Right now, it goes from Reconstruction into the Jazz Age. So in some ways, it drapes over some of the stories and the people that you see in the blues era that we meet in Angela Davis's work or even in Toni Morrison's jazz. But what I wanted to speak about specifically is to look for Black women where we're not expecting them to be, right? We're not expecting them to be with the Freedmen's Bureau or with local courts trying to advocate for their own rights in their house because literally everyone just got free. And the first thing that Black people did was establish households. And so if you think about the modern day kind of, and again, we're never supposed to reflect back, but if you think of the modern day instance that disproportionately women of color do not call the police when they are being abused because they know that their men are disproportionately targeted by the police. I have to think that as an emancipated person, an emancipated woman, you probably also didn't want to go to the state. Um, but their experiences were so horrendous, and the fact that they now had access to adjudicate something, they are practicing what freedom means. Um, it's interesting because Frank is my colleague, and I have a lot of conversations with him and Sadia Hartman in my mind. Uh, I have them in my mind, and also Fred Moulton. So, um, what I will say is, hmm, I agree. There's at some point, Sadia Hartman said that care might not be the right way to conceptualize what's going on in moments where Black women are advocating for themselves because everything is so traumatic. What I will say is sometimes sometimes we don't counter for, sometimes theory doesn't counter for the actual lived experience and what kept people alive and safe. So I think that we have due diligence in archives and in assembling information to bring whatever primary sources we have, whatever permissions we have to assemble information. But also I borrow from Jessica Marie Johnson and say that things can be both and. There isn't a definite answer. It can be both and. So I'm really dancing around the word Afro-pessimism right now. That's the word I'm dancing around in the back of my mind. And I think the answer is somewhere between critical fabulation and Jessica Marie Johnson's praxis of looking at data as being, it can be the same thing. It can represent both the racism of cat and sexism of categories that existed when it's being documented, whatever the it is. And it can also represent this moment of liberation for being represented. So that was a long answer. I don't know if I answered your question.
It was great and offered a lot that definitely gonna look into. So thank you so much. We do have a few other questions. One from Michelle Flamer with regard to the library company's extensive collection of racist trading cards. Why should we ever give or credence? Why should we ever give credence or historic validity to these cards as demonstrative of Black partner violence? Sorry, I read that weird. So I'm just going to reread it one more time. Why should we ever give credence or historical validity to these cards as demonstrative of Black partner violence? And also, if you could speak to the trope of African American man as brute.
So let me answer the trading cards first. Is this Michelle? Does Michelle work in photographs?
No, Michelle Flamer, I believe, is one of our board members. Yeah.
Board members. Okay. So I was actually directed to the trading cards by someone on the staff, and it was a treasure trove of information. I think the reality is, in order to understand African American women's long history of violence in this country, we do need to talk about these subjects that people would rather not speak about. Um, Everything is in danger of being stereotyped in a particular way. So when I went into this project, I thought particularly about the brute, right? Particularly about what does this mean when in this moment where Black men are being lynched, I'm also going to stoke the fires of they were beating women in their homes, or, and I'll expand it. There were same-sex relationships where people were being brutalized. It doesn't come out that way. You know, they aren't open about that's their partner. They are typically someone living in the same house. Why should we use the trading cards? Because we are in an era where we are sanitizing history. We are in an era where the calls to do away with AP African American history or critical race theory, or even taking down some of the Confederate monuments without erecting something in its place to explain how we got to this point. We are in danger of forgetting. We are in danger of, we had just talked about this generation is a very much a trigger warning generation. You can learn from the past and move on from the past. You can actually draw strength from the past. In terms of these trading cards, they were racist. But also, we need to know this. You need to know this. You need to know for every racist trading card or stereotype, there's someone who is sincerely trying different, unique, and might have been suffering under a different kind of oppression. So I guess my answer is don't look away from it.
Absolutely. And we have one more question from Heidi Ramirez. The images you shared are helpful in understanding the contexts and challenges that African American women faced. At the same time, as educators, we struggle with how to share without reinforcing, traumatizing, or exploiting. Any thoughts about how to leverage these and other images in honest and respectful ways in education? Which you somewhat touched on, but if you have anything else to.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that's asked a lot, especially for K through 12 educators. And I think that young people are more capable of are capable of handling more than we think they're capable of handling. Social media, they can see people murdered every single day. They're playing these video games. I could go on a whole tangent about how their lives are open to and kind of reflect different types of violent situations, so that a document from history shouldn't be what scares people. This is a fact. This is what happened. This is not something that someone necessarily made up. So I think that there's a way in which to render the subjects with dignity. And one way to do that is to show the context in the life that they lived. I'm a social historian, so I like people to see here is where they lived in, we'll go to my wheelhouse. Here's where they lived in Anne Arundel County, Maryland. Here's the demographics. Here's what it looked like if someone was a term slave. I think that it doesn't do us any favor by, again, sugarcoating or sanitizing. It just doesn't. I guess another way I would say it is I have the luxury of being a university professor, and I have the luxury of being a slavery scholar. And so I don't necessarily always give trigger warnings. It's implicit when someone enrolls in my class that there's going to be something that upsets them. So for K through 12, I'm not necessarily in this is a whole longer debate, Heidi, a whole longer debate. But I would just say that you do due diligence and you tell as much as the truth as possible. Maybe in a balanced way, maybe a balanced way isn't possible. Jennifer Morgan says that slavery is a metaphor that we're still in search of, right? We can't really replicate what it was like. And I would say that with almost any violent act, you can't replicate what it was like for the victims. So I think the best answer is the truth. I also have tenure, so I'm not going to be kicked out of anywhere yet.
Um, we have one more question by
Okay.
Scott. You've spoken about this somewhat already, but this person was thinking about Beth E. Ritchie's framing of the trap of loyalty,
Mm.
prompting Black women to avoid involving the state in domestic violence at the hands of other Black people. Do you see the trap of loyalty represented in the archive in any way? How do you think we might filter for it through the lens of record keepers?
So
Who
I do see it. Thank you. And this is what is challenging about this project is I'm trying not to read what we understand now about domestic violence back into the past, but it's almost like inevitable in trying to work out, right? As much as I just said there's not a metaphor for understanding certain things. We know so much more. And we know so much more about partner relationships than someone would have known in the 19th century. I would say that trap of loyalty might have been what happened when Antoinette went back to um, Abner several times. I would say that people are trapped. The trap of all I can say is yes, I agree it exists. I'm trying to work out how to write about it in a historic way that doesn't bring my vision of the 20th or 21st century back into the 19th century. I think it's a great question. It's something I'm struggling with. So if the person who asked the question has any advice, I would love to hear it.
I'm not seeing a comment from them yet, but I believe this conversation will be uploaded on our YouTube very soon. So if folks have more comments, feel free to leave it on our YouTube channel. I'm sure we can get it to Dr. Millward and perhaps email or any other ways they can get in touch with you. If there's anything you'd like to share for folks who might not have shared their question now. Um,
Sure,
yes.
you can always reach me at my email address, Millward, MILLWARD at UCI.edu. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm not that active, but you can always send me a DM, you know. But I'm pretty accessible.
Well, thank you so much for your time tonight,
Thank you for having
of
me.
course, your presentation, but also these very generative answers to our questions. So thank you so much. And again, to our guests, thank you all for coming. We do have another Black History lecture later this month. So hope to see you all there. Thanks again, everyone.